Welcome along to the polling station with Johnny Ward and William Kedjanyi, and you're not going to believe it. American politics is not actually the centerpiece. It's not the pivot feature in our show today. We're actually focusing on matters closer to home, in William's case, actually at home in Britain, because Boris Johnson has been in the news again, and the Scottish referendum, which is going to happen at some stage or other, is in the news again. And this all has relevance for punting the long-term strategy in terms of what's going to happen with the United Kingdom. William Kedjanyi, you told me pre-show that you didn't really have any, sympathy for our Boris because his comment about Scottish devolution and so forth was leaked. But on the one hand, it was kind of a private, chat and Zoom. But on the other hand, there were like 60 odd participants. And what are the odds that someone leaks something? What are the odds one of them doesn't even like him?
Well, the odds are very long odds on, I'd imagine, tens on that. Number one, they have pretty good connections. The Tory party, at least the parliamentary element of it, is very well connected to the country's press. And also, secondly, I'd imagine there'd be some frustration with him in general. A lot of Tory MPs on the backbench have been frustrated with Johnson's performance. They're hoping that 2021 will be better. But at the end of the day, his own comments have gotten him in hot water. And whether you're a unionist, whether you're a separatist, to say devolution was a disaster is frankly a political open goal for unionist causes. And, they have been on the up and up over the past couple of years.
Yeah, just an interesting one. So we had Paul Cushner-Murty on. I even had a professional footballer in Ireland text me last week saying, you had Paul Cushner-Murty on the show. The man is an absolute genius. Now,
correct.
I was very impressed. I was almost more impressed with Paul than I was of you, which is really saying a lot.
Thank you.
You impressed me greatly. But he was saying, right, I'm all over yes to Scottish independence. And our voting, or our betting is if this happens before the end of 2025. Now, is there a caveat that if Big Boris somehow is gone in the meantime, which again is odds on, might slightly change the picture?
I would imagine so, yes. Johnson is the most effective sort of PR campaign for separation possible.
Unwittingly.
Just because, Johnson is very easy to portray, well, primarily because many people believe it's true, as this elitist, out-of-touch toff who doesn't actually care that much about Scotland, despite claims to care about the whole UK. And also he is basically, many people believe, the architect of Brexit, certainly in a parliamentary form, and as such that voting imbalance between Scotland being against Brexit as a whole by a fairly big majority, and also the fact that the unionist vote is split, that all comes to help the SNP. Now, if Johnson was to be replaced by, and let's just say for argument's sake, Rishi Sunak, because he's the 15th vote favourite to take over from Boris Johnson, then things could change. I don't know about Sunak's approval ratings in Scotland, but generally speaking, he has better approval ratings than Johnson, and by quite a bit. It's fairly possible that sort of a slicker, more competent manager could change Tory fortunes in Scotland. My example for that, by the way, would be Ruth Davidson,
right?
Who was generally seen as somebody who could take on Nicola Sturgeon, who did it well. She was very media trained, being a journalist previously, and all that stuff sort of added up. And I think it's not, I don't think it's unfair to say that Ruth Davidson probably kept the Tories in power in 2017, just about, especially given their gains there. So that's something that could change the whole equation. The issue is, however, that it looks certain that Johnson will see through Brexit, whether it's with a deal or not. And even if we do get some sort of trade agreement, it is not likely, frankly, to be a very overarching one. It's going to be a hard exit. That's not great as far as Scotland's relationship with the Union is concerned.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Just on a completely off point, Rishi is going to be called Rich Rishi if this, the fact that he's, I was just reading this yesterday, that his former hedge fund was invested heavily in Moderna, which is just a fascinating subplot to the whole thing. I mean, there's so much going on with coronavirus, like two good bits of news in terms of a vaccine the last week, but particularly good news for Rishi.
Yeah, now he was meant to have, or he has, I believe, put his assets in a blind trust. The only issue is that we don't know everything there is to know about the blind trust, i.e. is much of this wealth offshore. And also, we don't know if he's going to stand to profit from it yesterday, which I think is an astonishing admission for a chancellor to make. Right, especially also
You
given
should
that,
have your hands on the purse strings in all matters, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a point to be made here, which is that corruption generally, and I think it is fair to call some of the PPE dealings corrupt, if not certainly cronyism, doesn't appear to have yet cut through. And this is important if you're looking at political positions in the here and now and also going forward. The big effects, basically, on Tory polling have been the Barnard Castle debacle, all the way in the summer, school exams, and free school meals. In other words, things that tend to affect parents who are homeowners, who can send their children to university and onwards. Possibly worth thinking about, although I should say that the Labour Party and the Tory Party are neck and neck in the polls at the moment. The last one I've seen had Labour with a 2% lead with YouGov. Interesting to note that the Tories are favourites, 8-11 to win the most seats in the next general election, but Labour are now 11-10. So it's looking tight even this far out.
We will get to Labour before we rattle off the end of the show, but Georgia is on our mind, and it was telling to remember just Paul talking last week about the something of a coup that Trump was basically trying to realize in terms of some of his sackings. It's been staggering stuff what he's been doing in terms of the cyber dude as well, who was basically just sacked because he said I think he said it was like the fairest election that we've ever had. But Georgia runoffs.
Yeah. Okay, so this is really, really important because the Democrats at the time of counting have flipped one Senate seat. That leaves them on 48 and the Republicans on 50. If they win these two elections in Georgia, they would have 50 seats compared to the Republicans' 50, and that would mean that Kamala Harris would break ties in the Democrats' favor. So the entire Senate is up for grabs. And you once again have a clash between what the polls are telling us and also what the market thinks. Now, we are 5-2 on with Star that either Kelly Loeffler or David Perdue manages to win their runoff election. We're 5-1 on that the Republicans keep control of the US Senate. Now, this is interesting because when you look at the latest polling, it's razor thin. Loeffler has a 1% advantage over Raphael Warnock, who's her Democratic challenger. And David Perdue has a 2% advantage over John Ossoff, that's his Democratic challenger. Now, if you were putting that virtually, you'd be tips on, basically, 10-11, 11-10, that sort of thing. But the market generally has Republicans as really strong favourites. Now, there's a reason for that. Georgia's a traditionally red state. Senate runoffs tend to have a different dynamic to Senate races that sort of come on the undercard of a presidential election. I remember in 2008, Democratic challenger Jim Meacham was beaten by just 3 points in the regular Senate race. It went to a runoff, he lost by 15. The Democrats haven't won a runoff race since the 1990s. But that said, there are plenty of really fascinating elements here. Firstly, can the GOP candidates keep that 10% of African Americans they got in the vote? Do white voters in the suburbs who moved away from Donald Trump come back into the fold for the Senate races? The story around the rest of the country would suggest that's likely to happen. But, however, Loeffler is an absolute diehard Trump supporter and everybody knows it. You also have to take into account voter registration drives, etc., things such as the coronavirus pandemic, all of that. So it's a really interesting political picture. And my feeling is that whilst Republicans would start as favourites with the incumbent advantage, I really don't think this is a race that is going to be simple, let's say. And it will be fascinating, by the way, one more thing. Polls going head-to-head with market opinion yet again. The market has this race as an extremely tight one. The polls have the Republicans as very clear favourites. It'll be fascinating to see how things move in that direction.
Yeah, Georgia was obviously one of the more fascinating aspects of the election, the fact that it did go that way. But just finishing off on Labour, we obviously have betting on to succeed Keir Starmer, and there was a speculation today, or maybe even more so, that Corbyn would not have the whip restored. What is the latest?
So he isn't having his whip restored, and has kicked off a complete firestorm once again within the Labour Party. Some people, or many people, are very unhappy that he hasn't had his whip restored, despite the fact he's been allowed, I believe, to return to the party as a member. He was suspended. Other people sort of believe that Labour shouldn't have let him back into the party. This is, of course, over the EHRC report, which looked at
anti-Semitism and so on.
Yes, and anti-Semitism. Some people might wonder how this relates to a betting contest. I would,
because everything does.
Indeed, on this show, everything does. I would say that this sort of thing is interesting in terms of testing what moves the polls in one direction or the other. Labour are still neck and neck with the Tories in the sort of averages of polling, the polls of polls. But generally speaking, they've had leads in a couple. It'll be interesting to see if the image of a divided party actually does much to the polls either way. A lot of people think that anti-Semitism was one of the reasons Labour lost so badly in 2019. It will be, again, I think, interesting to go back and look at what people said the reason was for not voting, because plenty of people said the leadership. I think also this is important for Starmer in the sense that he's taking over the party and making it more his own. Will there be another exodus of people in there who will describe themselves as Corbyn supporters?
Strong left.
So how? Yeah, and how will people respond to that? I mean, we have to remember that this story, or stories like these, internal party warfare, generally speaking, they tend to be for the political people. But that said, Labour received an awful lot of negative coverage for anti-Semitism over the last 2 years. I think we'd be a bit naive to suggest it didn't have some sort of effect on how people viewed the party. And remember that it's really important, looking ahead 3 or 4 years, Labour will want to improve their standing on the question sort of fit and ready for government. They've been doing that generally quite steadily. Stuff like this can really impact that.
Thanks a million, William.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, that was this week's polling station, and who knows what we'll be talking about next week. But obviously things will have moved on a little bit in the States, and we shall talk to you then.